Well, joining me now to look at some of the big political stories in federal politics are three observers from the different parties. Greg MacEachern is a longtime Liberal, Kate Harrison is with the Conservatives, and Robin MacLachlan is with the NDP. All three of you, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for being here.
Let's start, though, with something which a few weeks ago we were talking about because the Prime Minister had decided to call by-elections, but he called one by-election and left three by-elections uncalled. He called a by-election in Ontario, and now we're just learning today that from Liberal sources that the Prime Minister is ready to call the three other by-elections for January. By-election in Outremont in Montreal, by-election in York-Simcoe, and a by-election in Burnaby in BC. Where JAGMEET SINGH is running. Greg MacEachern, the accusation is that the Prime Minister, after having been very cynical about putting these off, is now causing maximum mischief because Maxime Bernier will be running candidates for the first time as of a few weeks from now.
Sure, that's great mischief. I think the bigger focus has been on SINGH and British Columbia.
Yeah.
The NDP leader has been asking for his by-election all of a sudden after ignoring a couple of other opportunities, and the NDP incumbent held on to the seat for a long time while he ran for mayor. Right. That set aside, I think it's probably good for SINGH that it's been delayed because the polls there for him are not great. There's a lot of supposition in town that the Liberals want SINGH to win the by-election because they want him to be the leader in the 2019 election. It remains to be seen whether or not he's going to win and what happens should he not win that seat. Okay,
I'll put the point to Kate. In terms of the Tories, is this not a bit more difficult with Maxime Bernier potentially having candidates in these three by-elections now, whereas if they were called 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, he would not be there in the contention. It's going to make life more complicated for the Tories.
In the ridings that the by-elections have been called, I'm not sure that the People's Party is going to mount much of a credible opposition. I think Maxime Bernier's biggest concern right now is that same poll that Greg referenced, which showed in an election he may not win his own seat for the People's Party in the riding of Beauce, that the Conservatives, in terms of the party brand, still outpoll the People's Party. So I think that it's less about what impact Maxime Bernier is going to have on these by-elections. It's more what is the impact of the NDP, which obviously impacts the Conservatives as well. It'll be interesting to see, I think, particularly in Outremont, how well the Conservatives do. They are putting a lot of resources and time and effort into Quebec. Does it pay off in any way? And of course, in Burnaby South, which I'm sure Robin would love to talk about, regardless of the outcome, a fascinating by-election, right? If he wins, does he come in and impress in the House of Commons? Does he get control of caucus? If he loses, what does that do to the party?
But is this I mean, just to stick with Maxime Bernier because I'm fixated on it, but I mean, is it
You're
not,
the only one.
But is it not, though, a very, very interesting test drive to see? I mean, these are all suppositions, and these are all some of this polling has been challenged. Is this not a test drive to see what potential influence he will have on the race?
In Conservative-held ridings, perhaps, right? So let's York-Simcoe, for example, that has been a long-time Conservative
Peter Van
seat.
Loan's former riding.
Peter Van Loan's former riding. He was there for many years. Is there enough of a libertarian, populist bent? Not only that, but is there enough of an organization there for the People's Party to actually draw votes from the Conservatives? I'm skeptical at this point. York-Simcoe would not be a riding that I would be spending a lot of time focusing on if I was Maxime Bernier, but yeah, it's a new element that the Conservatives are going to be watching and mindful of.
Robin MacLachlan, obviously the NDP were furious when the Prime Minister refused to call the by-election in Burnaby South for JAGMEET SINGH. What do you make of this decision now?
Well, it's interesting because it's not that far away from that last opportunity. So I think, if anything, and I wouldn't play too much into any mischief around Maxime Bernier. I really do think he's going to be such a non-factor in these by-elections that I don't know that the Liberals are really trying to play around with that. I think more than anything, they had a little bit of egg on their face after not calling it the first time, and they took a little bit of heat. It might have been a strategic play on their part, but I think the way that it played out in the public domain and with columnists actually trying to make the story about them rather than the story perhaps being about JAGMEET SINGH, which still did not have a seat. So yeah, this is a fascinating one. It's a really important one for the NDP. There's no doubt about that. I'm really pleased to see the Liberals are going to run a candidate in Burnaby South. I'm really pleased that we're going to have a by-election there. I don't think anybody in the NDP should be too worried about any riding level polls that put JAGMEET SINGH up against Justin Trudeau because there was no candidate declared at this time. I think that JAGMEET SINGH needs this test. He needs to prove himself. He needs a win badly, and he has an opportunity ahead of him, so it's on him now. And what I think is more interesting is that a lot of the issues that the government's perhaps most challenged on are issues that matter in Burnaby South. Housing, the pipeline, of course, that's the hotbed for that issue, Indigenous say over resource development. So we'll see how those issues play out at the local level.
I was going to say that because when you said you're glad, and you're speaking for the NDP or for yourself, that the Liberals are going to run a candidate against JAGMEET SINGH. The tradition has been that parties don't run a candidate.
It's not really a real tradition, though.
No, but it's been often observed. But you're glad that they're not going with that tradition.
Yeah, and I think you could historically do a pretty good analysis to point out that the only time they've ever not run a candidate is when it was strategically in their advantage not to run a candidate. So any parties make decisions based on what's in their strategic interest. So Elizabeth May and the Greens can stand up and say they've chosen not to run a candidate there, but it makes no sense for them to run one there.
Okay.
The Liberals should run a candidate there because by-elections are also an opportunity to a referendum on the government, and I think they should take themselves to the polls, and good for them for doing that.
Okay, Greg, just one last question. When I asked you the opening question, you didn't parrot the Liberal line, and that is that we didn't want to be running candidates over the Christmas holidays. We didn't want candidates.
Yeah.
Did the Prime Minister take a bit of a hit on this?
You know what, Robin mentioned that. I noticed, I was actually surprised with some of the columnists that were critical of the Prime Minister for this. I'm not sure it left a mark, but for me, I was kind of surprised because it took so long, and partly not of Singh's making, in that fact that the NDP leadership was so long. I don't think it was to his advantage or to the party's advantage that it took so long, but I think he did miss some opportunities. The other thing is I think no one really knew what he was doing. So if you're not going to run, I think he needed to be here and be visible. And when he was here, he didn't seem like he had a strong handle on the issues. So if you're not, boning up on policy and you're not trying to get into the House of Commons, what were you doing? Were you fundraising? We have no evidence really of that. So I think that was kind of his challenge to surmount in the eyes of, I think, a lot of politicos. Some of the pundits, to Robin's point, were critical of the Prime Minister that it did seem, a little petty not to do it.
Okay, I want to go to the other subject, which is obviously a lot of discussion today, and that is the government is poised to bring in, it's introduced and it's poised to vote on back to work legislation for Canada Post. It is there, it's ready. Labour Minister Patty Hajdu says that she is awaiting, that the parties are still negotiating, but it's there, and the framework is ready to be voted on as early as tomorrow, and then the actual bill itself. Let's go around. I want to start with Robin. What do we make of the perennial issue in Canadian politics of the Canada Post strike? Because there's been very few prime ministers who have not had to face some sort of labour disruption in Canada Post. Robin.
Yeah, and it's a tough one, I think, for the Liberals. It's not as tough when the Conservatives are in power because they don't get elected based on support from the Labour and from progressive voters that care about Labour issues. This one is tough. The Prime Minister goes to union halls. He had a lot of support from union members and says that he believes that a best agreement is the one negotiated through a collective bargaining process at the negotiating table. The problem when you bring the threat of government back-to-work legislation is, where's the incentive on Canada Post to negotiate? Why wouldn't they just wait for the government to bring the hammer down? So if you think the best agreement is negotiated by both parties at the table, then you have to take that hammer away and let them do that. It is always a sensitive thing, especially as we get towards the holidays, and it matters a lot to Canadians, especially rural Canadians who rely on that service. So it can be a precarious one for government to handle, especially if you're the Liberals or the NDP.
Okay, I want to let's go to the Liberals. Greg, any comments on this? I know you have a bit of a...
Full disclosure, I work with eBay Canada in my day job, and eBay Canada obviously has a point of view that they want Canada Post back up and running. Through my work with eBay Canada, I can tell you there's a huge amount of small and micro businesses in Canada that are dependent on Canada Post. Yeah. They don't have the resources to go to the big carriers, the big express guys. So there is an impact on that, and I think those people have been definitely making their voices heard. To the political part of this, the Liberals have improved. I think their goal was to do better than the predecessors and the Conservatives with labour relations. I think
setting the bar really high.
Yeah, super high. Thank you for the qualification.
Kate is going to have a chance to talk.
But they've also, in terms of other Liberal governments, I think they've done better. I think partly through the son of NAFTA deal, we see that a lot of the support that the government had was from Labour around the negotiations. So I think they have to be mindful of that. That being said, the union involved in this is very different than the other ones they dealt with. I think when this is all said and done, to your first question, there has to be some sort of resolution where there is long-term stability around Canada Post. Too many small businesses depend on it.
There seems to be, not, and I'll go to you on this, Kate, because obviously in 2011, the Harper government passed back-to-work legislation. Some people said in the blink of an eye, it was very quick. I think it was Lisa Raitt who was minister then, and it was almost immediate from the moment where it looked as if we had a strike.
Except for a filibuster led by Jack Layton.
Exactly. But the argument being that there's always a reference to the last Canada Post strike. The Liberals say they're not doing like the Conservatives, that they've given both parties plenty of chance to negotiate, almost a year's worth of negotiation. And that's different from the Harper approach.
Yeah, I mean, there was a little bit, truthfully, there was a little bit more time to try and figure this out than in 2011, but I do think that the impetus of the holidays approaching has a lot to do with why the government's acting now, and they probably feel a little bit more emboldened by some of the other labor reforms that they're making. You know, they've tabled a bunch of labor changes that would counteract what's happening in Ontario right now. So I think they're trying to kind of have their cake and eat it too a bit on this one, but ultimately, you know, I think it's the right decision for them to do this. You mentioned that this is a perennial issue, and I think the longer it continues to be that way, the less public sympathy and support there will be. I would really love to see any kind of information that suggests that millennial voters, for example, are all that on side with what Cup W is doing. I just think that this is such an ongoing issue. Well, that's right. Well, I mean, they do, and they're not Canada Post necessarily.
So Greg made a really good point. Because of e-commerce and the business model at Canada Post, I mean, it's not letter mail that's really bringing money. It's parcels and recurs. That also changes the work environment. So over the last 2 years, injuries have increased by 43%.
Their workload has gone way up.
The workload's gone up, the work has changed. So the employer needs to accommodate for that and make sure that the workplace safety is keeping up.
Is this, I mean, Greg and I were comparing longevity a little while before we came on this set, but is it an eye-opener in the sense that so many people have said Canada Post, oh, it's something it's gone the way of the dinosaurs, but not realizing that about parcel post.
You know, I've been in conversations where people have talked about who cares about cards and letters, but it's not about cards and letters. Canada Post is now making money, to Robin's point,
business model,
and it's because of parcels. And again, if that is changing the impacts on the employees, then I think that needs to be addressed. But Canada Post is finally making money. That's going to help the Liberal government fulfill their promises around home delivery, for example. So I think there's a new normal that they have to be aware of.
Political risk, though, as a Liberal, political risk of the government bringing in back-to-work legislation?
I think regardless of who I work for day to day, I think there's a huge fatigue in Canada around Canada Post and work stoppages.
Okay, well, we'll watch that with interest. Last word, thank you very much for coming in, all three of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.